Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani and welcome back to this channel on all things related to narcissism, narcissistic relationships, and just difficult situations overall. The topic I'm going to take on today is the issue of narcissistic grief, and very specifically how people who are experiencing the grief over a narcissistic relationship often feel very judged. The acceptance of a narcissistic relationship is often accompanied by tremendous grief. Grief is very much a universal part of the experience of people in these relationships and of people leaving these relationships. It's the acceptance that this is not going to change, the acceptance that it will never get better, the acceptance that you do not get to go backwards and get a do-over of childhood with more responsive or more available parents. It's the acceptance, perhaps, that your children will not get the vision you had of them, of two parents living under one roof model of a happy childhood. It's the acceptance that this is not how you thought your love story would go. This acceptance happens regardless of whether you leave the relationship or stay. And not everyone gets to acceptance, but if you don't, you're constantly living in a world of disappointment. And obviously, if you leave the relationship, or your partner leaves the relationship, or your family decides to step away, then there is the grief of the actual loss of a relationship. So it's losses all around, whether it's the loss of an idea or the loss of the actual relationship. We often reserve the term grief for the loss associated with death. But that's only just one piece of the pie of grief. Grief ultimately is about loss, meaningful, profound loss. The challenge is that while we in the mental health space may understand that others may not, and when you say you are experiencing grief, the first thing you may get back is, why? What grief? Nobody's dead. The experience of judgment that people in narcissistic relationships have to face is actually really unsettling for them as they go through their process of healing. It's either gaslighting. You'll hear things like, all relationships are tough. No family is perfect. It can't be that bad. Or it's the sense of shame that survivors feel for staying. They don't feel, for example, people stay in these relationships because they don't feel ready to leave. They feel too confused and they hold back on sharing with other people about the mess that their relationship is for fear of being judged when they stay in their relationship, and of their partner, or maybe it's the case it's a family member who's the narcissistic person. They know that if they talk too much about it, other people will view that person poorly, and that's going to be a problem if they decide to stay in that relationship. Or there's the isolation that comes from hearing about other people's healthier marriages or relationships or families, and either you might lie or soft pedal what your situation is so you can stay in the conversation to avoid a sense of shame, or just not talk at all, which is very isolating. Or you might have the experience of going into therapy and being told about your anxiety and being told, oh, you're very anxious, and maybe once you work on your anxiety, things will be easier in your relationship because your anxiety is probably really problematic for your partner. So it's pretty much judgment all the time for people who are going through grief. And then you may really start hitting it with the grief. It's as though the term has been annexed in a way that only certain people get to use it, right? You have a dead parent, then you get to talk about grief. If you have a narcissistic parent that you have to go no contact with, then people are going to tell you you're being difficult. If you have a dead spouse, you get to call it grief. If you have to face the unending anguish of having to either manage a toxic marriage or a toxic divorce and the contentious issues around joint custody, you'll hear back from people, oh, divorce is hard. You have a dead sibling, that gets to be called grief. If you have a sibling who continues to triangulate and divide the family and is making a mess of family accounts, businesses, trusts, or mistreating other family members, you'll get back, oh, families are tough, but you got to stick together. And what happens then is that the person enduring this narcissistic relationship feels as though they are not entitled to the language and the process of grief. And they get pushed into the language of a person who just has difficult and tense relationships and is just sort of struggling to figure all that out, instead of the far more robust vocabulary of grief. Most people have difficulty understanding that grief can be about the loss of what we hoped for: a loving parent, a happy family, a healthy marriage. And so it may not even be about a person, but a narrative, a simple want. I don't think, actually, it's aspirational to hope for loving parents. I think that's a basic human want, a very basic human deserving need. And that when a person gets into adulthood and recognizes that they didn't have the important psychological stuff of childhood that shapes a confident adult, it hurts. And a lot of time can get wasted ruminating about how could it have been different. Many people in adulthood look back at the child they were, looking to a parent or parents for consistency, validation, safety, compassion, support, and unconditional love. And it hurts to imagine what their child selves went through. People who endure this recognize that you cannot go backwards and unring that bell, but you can grieve it not happening in the first place. I've talked over and over about the loss of innocence that these relationships represent. Many people who are going through narcissistic relationships often feel that they have become cynical, for lack of a better word. They wanted to be open-eyed and open-hearted and optimistic and warm and fuzzy, and feel that because of this narcissistic relational experience, that open-heartedness has been taken. More grief over losing that. It'll take a minute, but someday you'll see that cynicism as discernment. Many people going through narcissistic grief have told me that others have said it isn't grief, that they are using the wrong word. And the gaslighting continues, basically, just keeps going on and on and on, that relationships end and people have problems, and that doesn't make it grief. So a lot of people will just sort of challenge your use of this word. Yes, it does. Something important and heartfelt was lost. Even if it was your belief system, that's extraordinarily important, something important being lost. When grief is judged, it impedes the process of grief. A person whose grief is judged may censor their experience or not allow it to flow out of them, or identify it as grief and or something related to grief. And when we are not given the space to have our grief, if we try to rush through it, if we try to avoid it, if we try to skip it, it comes back at us. And that can result in longer-term mental health issues, physical illness, stress, and distraction. Grief is simply one of those things that you cannot outrun. Grief also looks different after a person has experienced narcissistic abuse. And this goes beyond the scope of this video. But some stages of the grief process, such as anger, actually do look different than what we would consider to be traditional grief. In grief, for example, after a death, a person may be angry that a person who's died is gone, or that they went too soon. It's sort of almost an anger at the world at losing this person. In grief from narcissistic abuse, the anger is far more wide and complex. Anger that someone could behave like this. Anger that it happened to you. Anger that you didn't get out of the relationship sooner. Anger at getting bad advice about the relationship and sticking around because you kept fostering the hope. Anger at not understanding the dynamics of a narcissistic relationship. The complexity of the grief stages means that it takes a while. And that's the nature of grief. It takes as long as it takes. I often liken grief to the phases of the moon. You can't rush it. You can't slow it down. The full moon is always going to come sometime within 28 days. It's a process, and you can't wish it to come faster. Now, unlike the moon, grief doesn't follow a schedule. But just like that moon, you can't wish it away, and it takes as long as it takes. Judging narcissistic grief is like judging any emotion for a person. To judge someone's emotion is disrespectful, abusive, and it is a form of gaslighting. If someone tells you that you are not grieving, sadly, it means one more relationship you have to give a hard look at and assess at whether this relationship is healthy for you. And then in the midst of grief, the idea of more changes, more losses, more disappointments can feel overwhelming. Your experience of loss of relationship, loss of hope, loss of innocence is real. I hope this channel and other communities out there are showing you this, that these losses are real, no matter what it is you lost, and that because these losses are real and profound, grief is a meaningful way to characterize this. You do not ever need to prove your feelings or experience to anyone, and that pressure survivors of narcissistic relationships have, that they have to show up with proof of what happened, proof of their suffering, proof, look, this is what this person did. One of the most important things we can say to survivors of these kinds of traumatic relationships is, I believe you. And then go from there. I wish you strength in your process of grief. Thank you.